All right, so as we've talked about, we went through all the systems in the muscular system. We talked all about the different types of muscles. So a quick review, remember that there are three different types of muscles that we have in our body, those being skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Of those, that's the one we're going to focus mostly in on in the skeletal system, the only voluntary muscle. The one that does peristalsis is that smooth muscle, that with rhythmic contractions that are going to go from mouth to anus. And again, the cardiac muscle is going to contain those intercalated discs, highly branched, and again, they're going to be called slow twitch muscles, which we'll see later on in this unit, which is things that do not fatigue. Skip past this a little bit more. We've went through and we've talked about the different coverings. So if we're looking at our illustration here quickly, we can just shrink this down a little bit. Remembering that we have our large muscle. Surrounding that large muscle, we're going to have the fascia. Okay. And then if I break that down even further, so we're still surrounding the whole muscle, we have the epi. Break that down from the epimysium, surround each bundle, and surrounding each bundle is the peri. That each bundle or fascicle can be broken down to fibers. Surrounding each fiber is going to be the endo. And then from there, within the fiber, you have the myofibrils, and then you're going to have the two protein filaments, actin. Let's zoom in on that a little more. Actin and myosin. Alright, we already went through those. Here's your quick illustration. Remember that when we want to contract our muscles, the space that is within here, little drawing, that space is the space that's going to shrink. Because what we're going to see happening is in our next slide, back to this guy, this is that space. So the myosin is going to hook on to the actin and pulls that space to zero, causing that contraction. The only way we break that contraction is with use of that ATP that's being produced by the mitochondria. Move our way to the new stuff. Okay? All that stuff we've talked about. Here's a quick illustration of our muscles. Remember, we went through those. Shrink this a little bit as well. Those are your two diagrams that you can see on your test. Remember that every muscle that we do have is attached at least two different points. The point where it does not move, immovable, and the part that does. So every time you do a contraction, it goes from the point of insertion towards the point of origin. So insertion always goes towards the origin. You're going to have a couple sets of muscles. Some of them that are going to work together are synergists, meaning they're synergy, having togetherness, and antagonize is meaning the opposite or opposing direction. So examples, biceps, tricep. In the synergist, examples would be all four of the ones that are going to help out with the quad. Skip past those. Those are muscles that you should be able to go through and do. But the new stuff today, we're going to be talking about oxygen debt. Now, what this really refers to is when your muscles get tired, we can still make energy. But unfortunately, when we make energy, instead of a waste product being the great CO2, the carbon dioxide that you breathe out, we actually start to develop a chemical in our blood called lactic acid. Now, when you sit at your desk, you're going to do continual moderate activity. So what that is meaning is that you're doing enough activity to make all of the ATP that you need. However, there is going to be some activity that is going to take place, whether it's you're taking notes in your hands, with the muscles in your hands causing some strenuous activity, whether if you get up and start running around the room, strenuous activity. You're going to waste a lot of ATP and able to break the bonds of the actin and myosin. And in order to make that without the use of oxygen, we develop that chemical of lactic acid, and it starts to build up in the muscles, stopping the ability for muscles to contract. Now, we can get the oxygen back. However, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take several hours to repay all that, especially if you're not drinking enough water. Using the water is going to help recycle and try to push that lactic acid out of your muscles and help filter out through your kidneys, and then you can expel it through the body. Now, what is muscle fatigue? It's its ability to lose, or its loss in its ability to contract due to that activity. Muscles getting tired because we get this chemical built up inside the muscles. The lactic acid stops the actin and myosin sliding together. Right, lactic acid, you've all felt it before. It's that tingling sensation. If you were to go to do some workouts and you decide to do a bench press and you're doing a small amount of a weight, you do it the first set, you're like, okay, this isn't much of a problem. But if you do that same amount of weight for the same amount of reps 3 or 4 different times, it gets more difficult. Reason being, you're doing strenuous activity and lactic acid is starting to get built up inside those muscles. Okay? What is a muscle cramp then? All it comes down to is lack of this guy. ATP not being there. And if ATP is not there, it cannot stop the actin and myosin from being together. If we can remember going way back to one of our slides from before, quick, sure. If you take a look at this illustration, you can see that this is where the actin and myosin are going to bind on. If there is no ATP present to clip that off, they're going to stay locked together, keeping that contraction intact. Now, how do you make ATP? Some of you guys are more aware of it than others, but again, all it comes down to is needing food and typically oxygen. However, we just stated that if we do exercise, we can still make ATP. However, we don't make a lot of it. And our waste product, instead of being a waste, being a CO2, without, we end up making lactic acid. So, ways that muscles can fatigue. When you're in a sporting event, why are your muscles getting tired so quickly? Maybe it could be one of these things. You lost blood. Did you donate blood? Maybe you had a bloody nose. Unfortunately, females, on your cycle, loss of blood means loss of bringing the food, loss of bringing the oxygen to those cells, and if I'm losing those, I'm losing ATP. Loss of acetylcholine, this one isn't that much of a stimulated supply, but it's just saying if we're losing that ability, we're not even going to start the contractions. I wouldn't worry about this one as much, but the other three I would. Malnutrition, lack of glucose, which means lack of food. If we have respiratory problems, lack of oxygen. So this could be anything from asthma to anemia, so on and so forth. All right, so moving on, we'll wrap up our notes here. We're going to talk about muscle tone. What muscle tone is everybody has it. If you did not have muscle tone, you wouldn't be able to sit upright in your desk. It is achieved by a partial, sustained contraction or normal posture that does not hurt. Okay? Does not hurt. That's muscle tone. We'll be talking about a few other types of contractions other than muscle tone that's going to actually will hurt. And those we just saw a little earlier, cramps, how they do hurt. It's a sustained contraction that will be forceful that will hurt. Types of fibers, we mentioned earlier, slow fibers, resistant to fatigue. So you're going to see more of those in the heart and smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. You're going to have more mitochondria there, meaning that they can actually make more ATP, less of the ability to have problems with getting tired. Fast fibers, we see this typically in some of the very large muscles that you undergo with some hypertrophy. These are the ones that you undergo with forceful exercises. So when you do some weightlifting, new actin and myosin develop, but no new muscle fibers are made. So no matter the biggest guy and the littlest person in this room, no matter what, you all have the same amount of muscle fibers. You have the same amount of muscle, but the amount of actin and myosin inside the myofibril, those proteins can increase. If those proteins increase, it's like filling up a water balloon. You still have the same amount of balloons, but you can add more water to it. So it increases the diameter of that, which makes them look bigger or larger due to muscles. Now, if you don't use it, if you do not use your muscle, if you've ever been in a cast before, you understand that you undergo a thing called atrophy, where they start to decrease in size. So the muscles start to shrink. What's going to happen if you're not using it? Mitochondria say, well, you don't need me. And the actin and myosin degrade, and we utilize that for as an energy source later on in a different thing. However, if we're using a lot of it, we undergo hypertrophy, and this is where you said that the actin and myosin are going to increase in size. Fortunately, some of us have done these, where we end up going some muscle strains or muscle pulls, mild strains where you only have a few fibers, but you still have fascia all intact. But if you have a severe strain or a pull, you actually can tear some of your fascia and actually almost pull some of that off of the periosteum of the bone. So it can be very, very damaging. But here is the last part I want to talk to you about in terms of our contraction. Yes, you can have muscle tone that does not hurt, but these guys do hurt. Okay? Tetanic contractions, why do you get the tetanus shot? Is because you're getting a sustained forceful contraction due to bacterial infections that lacks relaxations. You can imagine that it's rigor mortis while you are alive. Awful, awful. You have partial tetanic contractions when you're like your foot cramps when you're sleeping or your calf starts to cramp up. Those very forceful contractions that hurt. It's begin again because of the loss of ATP to stop the actin and myosin from sliding together. We did mention rigor mortis. What is that all about? So look at that real quick. Remember that rigor mortis is the forceful contraction after death. If you're dead, obviously you're not breathing anymore. If you're not breathing, you're not able to make ATP. If you're not able to make ATP, you can't stop the linkage of actin and myosin. However, there is still calcium in your bloodstream. So the calcium is there. The calcium is going to land on the actin, causing the muscles to contract. Remember, it's like lock and key, that mousetrap. As soon as the calcium binds, actin puts it together and it causes that contraction to take place. All right, so in finalizing, just again, what's going to happen is that linkage is going to stay together, and the only way you can break that linkage is up to about 72 hours later. The actin and myosin, those two filaments here, will actually start to decompose, and then you can start to move them around. Last thing here, things you have to look forward to as you age. Unfortunately, you start to see that the body starts to break down. ATP and creatine phosphokinase and creatine phosphate start to decline. By the age of 80, you've lost over half of your muscle mass, and you start to see that this adipose tissue, which we know as fat, starts to replace a lot of the connective and muscle tissue. How do you stop that from happening? That keeps stopping it by exercising. The last slide is just a disease, myasthenia gravis. If you ever heard of it before, it's an autoimmune disease, meaning your body's attacking it. Receptors for acetylcholine on muscle cells start to become attacked, which starts to lessen the ability of a muscle to contract because it can't stimulate it, which unfortunately then sends the information to the muscles to not do contractions at all, which is, again, definitely an unfortunate thing. All right, so this is a very, very quick run through muscle fatigue, why muscles do get tired out due to the lack of ATP. You can still make energy. However, when you make energy without oxygen, you make a waste product of lactic acid instead of our carbon dioxide, which stimulates the muscles to stop contracting, making them more tired. If you have any other questions, please make sure you jot them down in a notebook, and we will then address them on Friday. Thank you.